Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We've got a really important and powerful topic today. We're going to talk about the top 5 challenges that companies face around failed payments. We'll dive into some of the best ways to think about solutions to really solve this problem once and for all. I'm thrilled today to be joined with Ray Watson. Ray is a Senior Vice President of Channels and Partnerships here at FlexPay. Ray has over 20 years of payments experience from companies like JP Morgan Chase, and Ingenico, and Lytle Vantiv. So it's wonderful to have you, Ray. Welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Steve.
All right, so let's get started, Ray. I really want to dive into these topics. I think we find when we talk to companies that there's often a lot of uncertainty and questions about failed payments and what the harm they cause and how to think about them and even how to think about the best ways to solve them. So let's get started by diving into some of the main challenges and the problems and the harm that failed payments cause companies. So it's obvious, I think, that if there's declined payment, it's going to cause some financial harm, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the big things is a lot of companies look at a failed payment as one transaction of whatever the AOV is. But what we try to say is you're not losing a transaction, you're actually losing a customer and all of those downstream transactions. So it's a huge financial impact on that.
And that's really because if the failed payment is not recovered, if they're a subscription customer, you've lost that customer and all the future revenue it would have delivered is actually going to be lost. It's not just a single transaction. And conversely, if you recover the customer, you're able to save all that revenue, right? So it's really a big swing in potential losses or wins based on how that outcome is.
Absolutely. And I explain it like this, if you think of it as a bucket and you're acquiring customers, you're paying a lot of money to acquire customers to put in the top of the bucket. Well, there's a hole at the bottom that represents that involuntary churn. And if those churn out forever, they're gone and you have to replace that with a new acquired customer. So obviously the more that you can replace the failed customers that you recover versus a new one, it not only reduces costs, but it can also minimize your attrition long term.
That's really important. And it seems sort of self-evident that if you lose the revenues, that causes a decrease in profitability. But there's a little bit more nuance there that really brings home the point that a lost customer through involuntary churn actually has an outside impact on harming profitability, right? And why is that?
Well, there's many reasons, but one thing that people don't consider is when you have your LTV, if you know the average amount of time your customers stay on the books, say it's 3 months or 5 months. Well, that includes all of your good customers and all of your bad customers and takes the average. But someone who is failing involuntarily, these are your good customers. They're not saying they want to cancel. They're actually inadvertently saying, I want the service, but they're canceling out. So you're actually taking away a really good customer out of that equation that can help increase your LTV. So there's a lot of direct and indirect impact financially on that.
Yeah, and I think also it's important to remind everybody that acquiring customers is a very expensive endeavor, right? We find that with subscription companies, often the average cost just to acquire a new customer can be 6, 8, 10 billing cycles. In fact, it's even more for companies that are offering SaaS services to business. It could be closer to 18 billing cycles. And so if the cost of acquisition is not even recouped, then that customer is immediately turned into a loss, right? So I think that idea that the recovery cost is minimal compared to the amount of opportunity that's created from the recovered customer. So again, it's a very heavy direct impact on the profit and the bottom line results of a company.
Absolutely. I mean, technically, a failed customer that you recover is technically a new customer. So at a significantly reduced cost. So yeah, there's a big discrepancy there.
Yeah. And let's talk about subscriber churn a little bit. You of course mentioned it. I think there's actually a phrase for customer losses where the customer doesn't intend to cancel, but they're lost as a result of a payment problem. It's called involuntary churn, right? I think it's incredibly important for companies to think about this and not just the context of an abstract term, but really start to understand what their rate is of voluntary churn and involuntary churn, because companies really to focus on specific programs and technologies to address the different kinds of churn, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. Actually, what we see a lot of merchants, they are hyper intuitive on controlling and managing the voluntary part of the churn. Someone who wants to cancel, they work on customer service, they provide incentives, they do win backs. They on that side of the equation, they put a lot of resources. But the other side of that equation, the involuntary churns, it's you may have the exact number, Steve, but it's almost the same amount. It's almost half of all churn is involuntary. So if you're only focusing on one side of that equation, you're missing a lot of that potential revenue on the other side.
Yeah, we find that involuntary churn is usually the largest single source of churn. It's often close to 50% of all customer losses. And of course, if all your energy is being put in the resources, the investments on trying to solve voluntary churn, unfortunately, what that really means is that all those efforts and dollars are only being targeted towards half of the sources of churn. So putting just much effort, enthusiasm, and visibility around the programs to solve involuntary churn can have a real outsized impact on reducing churn and increasing customer retention.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that you brought up a really interesting point a little bit earlier. I want to dig into it for just a minute. This idea that if you save a customer from voluntary churn, or sorry, involuntary churn, the profit impact of that is so much stronger than having to go out and acquire new customers. And I think when companies think about their overall mix, they have their steady customers, they are acquiring new customers, then they're losing some out the bottom through churn. But the consequence of losing a customer versus that is unnecessary versus the cost acquiring is really outsized, right?
It is. You really can't compare. I mean, the cost of losing a customer forever is obviously huge. And then you have to replace that with a new customer. The cost of a failed payment, someone you're not going to recover, that you're able to recover to bring back in the top of the bucket, it's such a small amount. It's a big difference. And, it's one of those things where, if depending on your type of business, some customers, when they fail involuntarily, if it's a discretionary service or a discretionary type product, they may never know that their bill failed. So there's no way to really cure that. There's other services where it's a little more, self-cure, but there's a really big impact, and the differences between, an acquisition of a new customer versus replacing a failed one is really astronomical. It's a huge issue.
Yeah, it's such an important point to understand. I think I want to actually spend another minute on this particular topic. We just conducted an analysis of one of our customers who offers SaaS software for some businesses. And what the data showed us was that for the customers saved from a failed payment, the lifespan of their relationship after the payment is recovered is about 95% the value of a new customer. It's incredibly long. In fact, we have been counting this up for about 2 years now. And right now we're seeing the average is close to 18 billing cycles post-recovery. That will grow as we have more time to analyze what the results look like. But just think about that as Ray mentioned, the cost of recovery is incredibly insignificant, but the amount of revenue that's being recouped in that business for 18 months or 18 billing periods is incredibly substantial. And if the average cost of new customer acquisition for a SaaS business is around 18 billing cycles, which is we find very common, again, just dramatic impacts on both revenue and profit delivery to the business, the result of being able to save those customers.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that too is what we touched on earlier. These customers that are failing involuntary, which is where we're focused. Voluntary churn is a whole different ballgame. There's departments and marketing people and customer service that handle that. But the reason that failed, recovered customers actually stay longer is because, just like we talked about, these customers don't want to cancel. That they're going to, at the very least, bill one more cycle because they're not canceling at all, and probably a lot more. So these are potentially your best customers that you could be losing, that you shouldn't be.
Yeah, it's such an important point. I think if there's anything that we can ask you to take away from today's session is the recognition. In fact, one of the best practices we find is that for companies that do have a failed payment solution in place, regardless of whether they're working with a company like FlexPay or whether it's home built, to measure the retention of the customers and lifespan, the LTV, fall and recovery, because that really gives the insight into understanding what the total amount of impact is at stake. And if you're evaluating different solutions and you see what may seem like marginal improvements in failed payment recovery rates, you need to multiply that, amplify that by the additional billing cycles that are recovered following or earned following recovery, because that really is a much more accurate financial evaluation of the benefits from increasing payment rates or recovery rates, even in fairly small numbers.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Agreed.
And I want to encourage everybody that's on right now. We've got a really, really big group. If you have any questions throughout today's conversation, feel free to throw them into the Q&A box, and Ray and I will address them before we get to the end of today's session. Okay, so let's change gears a little bit and talk more about the whole idea of why recovering failed payments might be a little harder than it seems. I think a lot of companies that we run into, particularly bigger companies, have, in a very positive way, recognize that failed payments are a problem for them, that they're seeing declines, and they've taken the first step often of just building a simple solution internally to retry the failed payment. But the reality is that trying a simple solution is often incredibly ineffective compared to what the potential value is from recovery, because of the complexity of the payment system, because of the complexity of why these cards are being declined. So let's start with one topic, which is when we look at the credit card payment system, there really is a misalignment between the objectives of what you as a merchant want to accomplish, which is simply be able to have your customers use their credit cards and submit payments and get them approved as they should be on legitimate transactions, versus what the banks that issue the cards to consumers and businesses are trying to accomplish. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the ecosystem, all three stakeholders, the bank, the merchant, the customers, everybody wants 100% authorization. That's a no-brainer. The thing is, the issuing banks, however, they are on the hook for any fraud financially. So if it even smells like fraud, they'll kick it out. And let me tell you why. And it's kind of one of the reasons why we see an increase in the involuntary churn. For the last several years, banks have always had this liability. It's been gigantic in the tens, hundreds of billions of dollars per year. And what they're doing is they're shifting that liability from themselves to the merchant. So as I mentioned, if it's something that even just looks a little bit like it might be fraud, they're just going to kick it out because they don't want to deal with it. And they're having the merchant have to work all the reauthorizations and try to recoup it. So it just shifts all that huge liability that the bank had to an even larger liability globally to the merchant. So everybody wants to solve it. We all want 100% authorization. It's not realistic at this point, although at FlexPay, that's our ultimate goal. But that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a big shift. You're always going to have non-sufficient funds. You're always going to have bad card numbers. But there's been a big spike in potential fraud that you don't always see because it's not always in the decline code that you would expect it to be.
Right. The false decline rate seems to be increasing. The rates of fraud are continuing to increase. And the bank's reactions are trying to do everything they can to avoid their fraud losses. And that has shifted the burden to merchants. And again, I think that's the one topic or the one theme that everybody can agree on, which is the levels of fraud, the sophistication of the bad actors that game the system are increasing. So this problem is not going away. It's going to become even more exacerbated in the coming years as the banks are continuing to struggle with their fraud losses. So one of the misconceptions we run into is that if a payment was failed, every failed payment is very, very similar. Like it was just declined. So why can't we just retry it? And the reality is more complicated, right? I think there's the number I've seen is that there's about more than 25,000 unique banks just in North America that issue credit cards to consumers, the businesses. There are different types of cards with different risk profiles. And each of these different banks run different rules for what's approved and the banks own the algorithms and decision-making for what's approved, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So yeah, thousands of banks just in North America. There's no consistent standard on, how the decline codes work. So for instance, a do not honor at one bank is an invalid transaction at another, or transaction not permitted at another. All of these could be suspected fraud. What they're doing is they have buckets and they put them in different buckets. And what's happening, it's not always the issuing banks. It could be the processors, the gateways. Everyone has their own level of how they categorize that. So it would be really great if we could all get under the hood and look up a little bit deeper in what exactly caused the decline. But as of right now, it's not possible. So and what makes it even harder than that is that it's always changing. So if you are using a retry logic where you have something specific to a certain decline code, it can be a lost cause because that decline code might not be what it is. Now, there are certain hard declines and soft declines. Those two are separate. You'll always know the hard and the soft. And non-sufficient funds are pretty self-evident, but there's that squishy middle where there's not a real defined term for it. It's been declined. It's not because of funds. It's not because of a bad credit card. It's for something else. And that something else is where it becomes really gray. And that's where having a very strategic, targeted approach to every transaction is beneficial.
Thanks. And I think that should really hopefully ring true for everybody. The idea that if you're trying a one-size-fits-all approach, if you're treating every failed payment as it's just another failed payment and don't understand the nuances that what looks like a decline reason from one bank is not the same decline reason that another bank is using, and don't optimize your recovery solution to be able to deal with that complexity, then you're under delivering what your potential is. The next idea I think is also quite profound. Every subscription business essentially is in business because of that basic strategy that you can acquire customers. You want your customers to stick with you as long as possible. And the longer those customers are customers, the more profitable they are to you. So when we think about when we recover a customer from a failed payment, the objective should not be just on driving a short-term recovery, but optimizing the entire process, whatever method you're using for recovery, to also deliver the recovery, but the long-term retention of that customer following recovery, because that really what drives your ultimate profitability. How should companies think about that? And if there are different options available for different decline types that require different approaches?
There is, of course, yeah. Just as an example, there's a couple things. So obviously, a hard decline is a hard decline. There's some things you can do with that, but not all. Some hard declines can turn into soft declines, which can be eventually recovered. But most of the things that you can do are, as an example, there's 120 different data points in a payload. If you don't have access to that particular issuing banks and what they're doing, you don't know exactly what's causing the issue. It could be something in the address field, for instance. Non-sufficient funds. Obviously, a lot of people do hey, we're going to try this every day or every other Friday, but there's certain specific ways that you can do just non-sufficient funds. So there are ways that you can tailor it to an individual decline code. But if you don't have access to the particular issuing bank and what their behaviors are, or access to certain other data points that come from that bank, you don't have the full picture, and you're essentially just guessing.
Yeah, I think one of the other areas I want to dive into for just a minute is what you said about the difference between hard declines and soft declines. If you're not familiar with the phrase, a soft decline has the most often, and it's not a complete hard and fast rule, but generally the ability to solve the problem directly with the payment system by finding a way to resubmit it and present it to the bank in a way that it will be approved is very viable. In fact, that's our preferred method, because if you can resolve the failed payment directly with the payment system, the customer is never aware of the problem, and so they just continue as a natural life cycle that when it unfolds. But some decline types, the hard declines, where perhaps the card has expired or it really was reported as fraud, so the card is no longer active, will require cardholder involvement in the process. And we see many companies, one of the methods they use internally is not just a retry solution, but they'll actually send all the failed payments over to their customer service team with the logic that, well, my customer service team knows our customers, so they should be able to interact with them and have the customer respond and find a new card to be able to use. But there's two flaws in that logic. One is that your customer service team is a very expensive resource, and really their motivation should be focused on dealing with customer problems related to your product. But secondly, what that really means is that you're alerting your customers unnecessarily, a large swath of them, to the ones that can be resolved with the banking system, to the problem occurred, which is a bad brand experience. And so the idea that you really want to limit customer exposure and only use the methods of direct communication when they're absolutely necessary. And the system you use should be effective enough to be able to parse out what solution is most appropriate and use them selectively, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And it's important to note that, there's certain declines that our system may look at it and say, you know what, don't try this at all. You're never going to recover this. You're going to have to reach out. But you're absolutely right. One of the downsides of potentially reaching out to a customer that you don't have to, and I'll say the big part of, FlexPay's business is that, we've trademarked the term invisible recovery. We're trying to get that recovered before the customer even know there was an issue with their card, because it does cause friction. Because if you have to reach out, that customer has to make another buying decision. They've already made the decision once to buy your service or your product, and now you're saying, hey, this failed and we need you to update your card. They have to, in their minds, they have to make that decision again, because they can just say, I don't want to do it. And there could be some brand damage. I can tell you, if my card fails at a merchant that I'm working with, and I know my card is good because it works everywhere else, I'm going to blame that merchant. So there's a big brand issue and net promoter score that a lot of people don't look at. It's not a direct financial impact, but it can absolutely affect your business.
Yeah, it's such an important point that when the customer is made aware of the problem, when they do have to be involved, they can choose not to participate. And if they passively choose not to participate, the end result is a churn customer, and we want to avoid that at all costs.
Yeah, and I think I've seen it. I think what we saw is 30% of customers that are contacted will either just cancel or just, like you said, just passively decline. They just won't respond back, and they're gone. And that's what happens when you have to reach out to them.
Yeah. So it's a great segue to talk about what specialized solutions look like and why they're really more effective than, in our experience, every single home build solution or build solution that we've ever run into. And I think it really speaks to the idea of when companies think about their payment system and how to optimize it, they do have a choice of building something internally or working with tailored solutions that are specially built to solve the problem. It's sort of they'll build versus buy a decision. And it's clear when you think about, again, the complexity of this, the thousands of banks, the hundreds of decline codes, that it's really hard for a merchant to have access to enough data to build algorithms that can effectively solve the problem, right?
Definitely. So most merchants usually have, they only have the data that their customers or past customers have. That's the data they have to use. And if you compare that to a FlexPay, I'm going to be self-serving. This is our webinar, but we have billions of data points from our partners, our issuing bank partners, our fraud partners. So we can compare back and forth. And the machine learning continually learns. So we've seen that our recovery rates will continue to rise. Just to give you some anecdotes, we mentioned there's thousands of banks in North America. Just to give you a couple of examples, our system will look at over 120 data points in the payload. So this could be, geolocation, card type, issuing bank is obviously important, gateway codes, special characters, et cetera, et cetera. So what can happen is if something fails because of suspected fraud, it could be a couple things. It could be a timing issue. We might say, hey, you know what? You're doing batch files in the middle of the night, and there's certain banks that tighten up their fraud filters, and it's kicking up the score and kicking these out. So it could be a timing issue, or it could be something as simple as we see in the payload that there might be not an error, but something inconsistent. It could be, like I mentioned before, it could be, I live on Petunia Avenue, and it might be AVE period. And maybe it should just be AVE or spelled out Avenue or a ZIP+4 issue. There's little things that you can do to lower that score to do that. And then lastly, on non-sufficient funds, which is common to probably everybody on this call, if we know that if it's a big bank like Bank of America or Wells Fargo, if you make your payment, they're going to do their open to buy immediately. But there's thousands of banks, small banks, and credit unions who they don't do that. They don't have the technology to do it. So if our system knows that a small credit union in Southeast Florida does a open to buy at 3 p.m. Eastern time on a certain day, then we know that 3:15 p.m. Eastern time is a really good time to try that. So there's a lot of data that we have that we use that the particular some merchants obviously don't have.
Yeah, just for clarity, we built a AI powered system that's especially designed to handle this kind of complexity. And I think the point that Ray made is so important to recognize that even the things you can do to improve the likelihood of a successful approval don't work the same way across every bank. And your system needs to understand at the bank ID level, the BIN number, how each bank responds, what their biases are in the algorithms, and unless your system is able to be trained on that kind of data set, then it's just not going to perform at the same level. Another important point is that even in the world of the transactions that we can submit that have failed directly with the banking system, that a NSF should be treated differently than a do not honor, which should be treated different than ever decline codes. And FlexPay, for example, I believe we're on our 30th generation AI model, but what's really important to recognize is that we've actually have enough experience and enough results and optimization that we have multiple models running, each optimized for different decline types. Can you talk about a little bit about that, Ray?
Yeah, it's something that it's really cool. We have multiple models continuously running. It's always a champion challenger. So if one model is doing better than all the other ones, that's the model we use. If something changes, because this changes, it's dynamic. Banks change all of their behaviors dynamically. So we have to constantly know that, and our machine learning will keep feeding the data. So it's a great way to know that you're getting the best possible outcome. Having that, and I think that's really cool. That's something that it's hard. I think not a lot of companies take that approach, but when you have the data that we have and you have the ability to do that, it makes a huge difference in success and performance.
It does, and we see it every day. We're pretty unmatched in either performance against other players in the space, and absolutely against the home built solutions. There's one last topic I want to broach here, which is a new rule that's coming out from MasterCard and Visa that, if you're not aware of it, it's incredibly vital for you to understand this. There's a new operating principle that MasterCard and Visa are going to be using. I believe it's called the VAMP guidelines. And what they've done in the past is they've sort of softly tried to disincentivize high numbers of retries. So the companies, for example, that just hammer the retry of trying every day for 30 days will deliver some results, but there hasn't been a lot of downside to the merchant account health result of that. But MasterCard and Visa are changing their rules. They're going to specifically start penalizing merchant accounts that have retry counts that will raise the risk score, which will create more failed payments. Is there something more you can tell us about that, Ray? Because it's such an important insight for companies to know. Because frankly, what happens is that if you're caught in that, if you have a retry system that is using high amounts of retries, which is very likely to deliver the results that you're getting internally, there's going to be harm that comes in April when this goes live.
Yeah, and what they're doing is they're shining a light on this, and they're making it a formal process. But I can tell you, just being in the payments industry for as long as I have, I see this all the time. They've always tacitly been doing this. If you have, the ratio attempts to authorizations, if it's higher than a threshold, the card brands will start dialing back the total authorizations for that overall mid. And that includes not just your recurring, but that includes your initial shopping cart, customer initiated transactions. That's why a rules logic, it can be dangerous, because if you're just guessing, you might be guessing wrong. You might, Visa and MasterCard, I think they allow 15 retries in a period of 30 days. Well, our system will do that. Our system might have certain, transactions where we do it 15 times, but overall, our average is less than 4. So as I mentioned before, there might be a time where we say, hey, there's this transaction, you're not going to, we see something that says it will never, ever authorize. So don't try it. You're wasting those authorizations, and you're increasing your chance of getting, deemed on your authorization. So It's a big deal. And I think what they're doing, Steve, is they're just shining a light on that. They're formalizing it, and they're making it to where they're telling you they're doing that now.
Yeah, and again, talking about the FlexPay system for just another minute, our algorithms were specifically designed to deliver high recovery rates, do so in a way that maximizes retention, but also don't do harm to the merchant account. It will make decisions to not pursue individual transactions when it believes there's a high risk of a chargeback or a refund. So specifically minimizes that, which is obviously what everybody wants to see. So I know we're going to be running out of time soon. One of the big questions that we run into companies or get from companies, and I've got a couple questions from Michael that I do want to address, is that if we use a specialized solution versus our in-house solution, what impact does it have? Does it actually translate into financial benefits for us? And we ran a survey about 2 years ago, and we were specifically asking the question. We surveyed over 100 companies that have recurring billing models and benchmarked both their financial performance against the practices of what they're doing around payments. And what we found was that the companies that are using specialized recovery solutions that recognize the problem and have applied the best-in-class solutions are 10 times more likely to be a top financial performer than their peers that are not using specialized and they're trying to deal with this in-house. Think about that, a 10x higher likelihood they're a top financial performance. It seems like an outsized benefit, but when we talk about the impact that recovering failed payment has, not just in revenue, the compounded growth that is delivered in revenue from being able to retain customers longer, and the direct relationship between the revenue from recovered customers and the bottom line profit contribution, this starts to make a lot more sense. That's the kind of impact that it can be unlocked. So we absolutely encourage your strategies around failed payments, around customer retention, to look into this and start addressing or evaluating the options that can really maximize the performance of the system. On the desktop, I want to point out that there's a couple of documents that have this case study and some other information. One of the documents that we encourage you to download is our scorecard, our involuntary churn scorecard. It's a great way to take that and use it to compare different options that are at your disposal. It also provides the prompts for you, the questions you should be asking, and they'll rank order the different options against each other. It's a great tool to have, whether you're evaluating FlexPay or not. We definitely encourage you to download that and use it. We're going to stay on for a couple more minutes. If you have any more questions, I do want to get to Michael's questions. Michael had two questions. One is, I believe he was asking about the ratio of involuntary churn to voluntary churn. And he was asking, is that still relevant in the services sector? Is it still 50%? And the answer is absolutely. It's very similar for both B2B and B2C companies are serving those different audiences. The likelihood that a business card is declined is very similar to a consumer card. The same factors are in play with how the banks evaluate them. So it's exact same outcome for those companies. Michael also asked, what is the standard recovery rate that a company sees internally versus FlexPay? And Ray, I think our average is that we tend to deliver 50 to 60% better recovery on the transaction level, which of course plays out and gets amplified by the LTV effect, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. The 50 or 60% is in above of what a rules-based system would do. But it's also important to note that it changes a little bit. It depends on your baseline. So for instance, a customer with, a discretionary type service that I mentioned, we may see, maybe it's a digital service or publishing or something like that. We may see a 15 to 20% decline rate on average, and then a recovery rate of about the same, about 15 or 20 or maybe 25% of those that you'll be able to claw back. But if it's something that maybe it's a more non-discretionary service, could be a Netflix, for instance. Or, if your Netflix turns off, you're going to know it immediately, and you're gonna fix it. Well, it's a whole lot of a different number. But typically in those types of companies, utilities and things like that, the numbers can be much higher in terms of, or much lower in terms of recovery rate. But in those scenarios, every little bitty bit of recovery makes a gigantic impact on your business. So it's all the long answer to your short question, Steve, is it's relative. But we typically see about usually 20% decline, 15 to 20% decline rates in our portfolio, and about a 15 to 20% recovery rate on those. And we typically get 50%, 70%. Some of them we do much, much higher. I get in trouble from our customer service team, but there's some that are well over 100% that we do above what they do.
Yeah, and every company is different. Every scenario is different. And if you're curious, we definitely encourage you to reach out and we can connect and run an analysis for you to look at your business and actually provide a forecast both on what we expect the recovery rate improvement to be and then how that forecasts out in revenue contributions as a result of the LTV effect. Lastly, Jane asks, and I was referring to before around the study we ran around the fact that the companies who use specialized solutions are 10 times more likely to be a top financial performer. Jane asked, how is top financial performer defined? Great question. So in the research study, we asked two questions. What was your revenue growth rate and what was your profit percentage? So that was the way that the top financial performers were benchmarked. The relationship between usage of a specialized solution and both the rates of revenue growth and the profitability rates. Great. So I think that is the end of the questions. Again, Ray and I will stay on for a couple more minutes if you'd like to have anything else submitted. But in the meantime, I really want to thank you for joining today. Really appreciate your interest in this topic. It's so important for companies to solve this problem. There's some great technologies like FlexPay that will give you the state-of-the-art results and the financial return on making this choice is so profound that we absolutely encourage every company to pursue this. And again, we believe that our solution is the best, and we are confident, and we go through a test to be able to prove it to you. But definitely choose the best solution that's available that meets your needs, and the impact on your business will be quite substantial. So Ray, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and your insights.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you inviting me on, and that was fun. Let's do it again.
Fantastic. And we'll stay on for a couple more minutes. Feel free to, if you have any more questions to throw them into the Q&A chat. Thank you.